Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Pan On, Fan On, Why Your Home's Air Quality Matters. I'm Harriet Richardson from the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, and I'll be your facilitator for today's session. And on behalf of the panel of speakers, some of which you might be able to see with their cameras on, we're delighted to have you with us, whether you're joining from London, across the UK, or much further afield. This session is part of London Climate Action Week 2025, the largest independent climate change event in Europe. With over 300 events, London Climate Action Week is a powerful platform for connecting research, policy, and action. And we're also just a few days past the UK's Clean Air Day, making this webinar an especially timely conversation. Today's topic, indoor air quality, often goes unnoticed. Yet we spend 90% of our time indoors, in our homes, schools, workplaces. But what's in the air we breathe? How does it affect our health? And what can we do about it? The INGENIOUS project, funded by UK Research and Innovation, has taken a deep dive into those very questions. By studying over 300 homes in Bradford, a city in the northern English county of West Yorkshire, the research has uncovered critical insights into how pollutants form indoors, how our everyday behaviours affect air quality, and what we can do to make our spaces healthier and more sustainable, especially as we move towards net zero, more energy efficiency measures, and airtight homes. So today you'll be hearing from an expert panel, including Professor Nick Carslaw from the University of York, who will open in a moment with an overview of the INGENIOUS research. Professor Nicholas Pleece from the University of York, who will chair our discussion panel, and also Professor Catherine Noakes from the University of Leeds, Dr. Chris Brown from the University of Leeds and born in Bradford, and Ali Boddy from Global Action Plan, each bringing a unique lens on health, behaviour, data, and action. So just a couple of quick housekeeping points from me. This session is being recorded and we'll be uploading it to the York Environmental Sustainability Institute's YouTube channel. Your microphones and cameras are off, but we absolutely encourage you to engage by posting your questions in the Zoom Q&A function at any time. And you can find that in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. You can also add comments in the Zoom chat. And behind the scenes, the team can support with any tech issues. So just message in the Zoom chat if you need help with anything. So now I'll hand over to Professor Nick Carslaw to introduce the INGENIOUS project and walk us through some of the key findings. So over to you, Nick.
Right, can I just check that you can see my screen, Harriet?
Yes, and just adding it into presenting mode, and then that's all good.
Okay,
Perfect.
right, brilliant. Okay, well, thanks for that introduction, Harriet, and welcome to this webinar. So I'm just going to start off by giving you an overview of the INGENIOUS project. So this is a 4-year project funded by UKRI, as Harriet said, and the fundamental aim of this project has been towards understanding air pollution in homes. So what are the things we do that lead to air pollution in our homes, and then hopefully at the end of the project, what are we going to do about it? So for those of you who wondered where the acronym came from, you can see at the top there. We're coming to the end of this project, which has gone on for 4 years. And basically it's been split up into 4 work packages. So for those of you not familiar with scientific projects, we tend to subdivide big projects up into smaller ones. So we had 7 areas that we were working on, and you can see them listed here. So we had some laboratory experiments I'm going to talk about in a little while. We had our measurements in homes, that's work package 2. We then spent a bit of time driving around Bradford outdoors with a van where we could try and look at emissions from indoors outdoors. So do emissions from homes actually affect outdoor air quality? We had our modelling work package. We've got a work package where we try and link some of the pollutants we've measured to health effects. An interventions work package where we're trying to understand how we could improve indoor air quality in homes through simple interventions that we ask people to take part in. And then we've got a dissemination work package. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on the first two of those today. We are in the period of getting lots and lots of results. So there's lots more information coming. And I know we've got a mixed audience today, but for anyone that's interested in more of the scientific details, you can see there's a paper there that was published a couple of months ago, and that talks in a lot more detail about all of our objectives and all of our methodology as well. So if you're interested in that, you can have a look. If you don't catch it, then email me at the end. I can send you a copy as well. Okay, so I just wanted to talk you through some of the facilities we've been using at York. So this is mainly in support of the first work package, looking at emissions from various things we do in our homes. So we've got a range of facilities and chambers set up at York. We've got some labs as well, and also the mobile van, which you can see in the middle there. So that was the one that we can either drive around and make measurements as it's driving, but sometimes we also just park it up close to a building where we might want to monitor indoors. So it means that we can look at a few more buildings. So you can see we've got various things going on in fume hoods, so cooking experiments, frying, looking at emissions from different meals that we put together. And I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the image on the right hand side there, you can see a tall chamber that looks a bit like a phone box. And that was where we did all of our cleaning studies. So we actually had a glove box put in here so that the scientists could actually go in and clean things without being in the box themselves. So we could look at things like emissions from bleaches and other cleaning products. So that's some of the facilities we have. So we're very lucky at York. We've got a range of really cool instruments that we can use to understand these emissions. And then I'm just going to talk about our cooking experiments. We've also done a whole load of experiments looking at cleaning, like I said, but also things like scented candles and diffusion, various diffuser devices as well. So we've got a whole load of information on all of these things. But for cooking, we focused on three basic meals: a stir fry, a curry, and a chili. And for each of those, we had a vegetarian version and a meaty version, because we're interested in looking at different types of meals, but also whether vegetarian meals made a difference to the emissions we measured compared to meat. So we're very careful in the way that we did this. We had 6 recipes that we standardized. So we had very defined protocols. So for instance, we'd use the same pan and the same hob for each meal that we looked at. And then we would heat the pan up to the same temperature before we added the oil. Then we would heat the oil to the same temperature before we added the meat, and we'd do that at the same time. So it was all very tightly defined and allowed it to be reproducible as well. So you can see we've got a whole load of ingredients there, and every time we did these meals, we got the ingredients from the same place. And then we also had a really good handle on the cooking times as well. Okay, so that was the kind of recipes we were cooking. And then I know not everyone on the call would be a chemist, so I'm just going to explain what you're looking at here before you all start panicking and leaving the call. And it's just thinking about when we cook meals, you'll be aware that when you cook, you can smell things cooking. Of course you can, and that smell is coming from the various volatiles that are emitted as you cook. And we were interested in looking at different classes of those compounds because we know that they do different things once they're emitted. So we're particularly interested in any of these compounds that are emitted from cooking that might go on to react with something that's harmful to health, for instance. Okay. And the other interesting thing here is that we noticed that different types of compounds were emitted from different parts of the cooking process. So if we just focus on a couple of them, so these plots are quite complicated, but basically we've got the time along the bottom here. So we started cooking at time 0. If there's anything happening to the left of that 0, it means that there were emissions before we started cooking of this particular chemical class. And you can see that's the case here with these compounds that are called terpenes. And basically, these are the compounds that you will find in lots of herbs and spices that you use to cook. And before we started cooking, when we were doing this meal, which was I think this is a stir fry chicken, basically we were chopping up lots of spices to put into the meal. And you can actually see that we start to see emissions coming up from, sorry, I hope you can see my pointer, the bottom left figure here, you can see that green line sloping upwards, and that was the spice preparation. If we look at the top right picture though, on the other hand, you can see that the emissions start to increase much later. And these long-chained alkanes, like this one showed here, so this is long chains of carbons with hydrogens attached. These tend to be emitted when we start to heat up oil. And then down the bottom here, we've got the alcohols. I'm sure everybody's heard of alcohols. And we can see the big emissions start here when we added the vegetables and then the stir fry sauce. So the interesting thing is that you get these chemical fingerprints corresponding to different parts of the meal as you cook. So on this plot, we're looking at the total emissions now, all of the kind of aroma chemicals that are emitted when you cook these different meals. And these are the total from the different meals. So you can see that the chilies emitted more of these volatiles than the other meals on average. And it's also interesting to see that vegetarian chili emitted higher total emissions than the meaty version. So the reasons are basically due to the way with food breaks down when you cook it. The chili sauce as well has predominantly more tomato in it than the other meals, so that leads to more alcohol emissions. There's lots of detail in the paper if any of you are interested. And then this plot at the bottom is showing the percentage of the emissions by the different chemical compounds. And you can see that by far the biggest emission from all of these meals is alcohol. So that's, I guess, interesting to the chemists in the team, perhaps less so to everyone else. But what it shows is that you get variation between meals, variations depending on if you use meat or vegetables. And this sort of information can be used to directly inform the UK atmospheric emissions inventory. So there's very little known about indoor emissions at the moment. Okay, so let's move on to sampling in our homes then. So we were really lucky to work with the Born in Bradford team on this. And basically the Born in Bradford cohort's a very famous health cohort where about 12,500 mothers were recruited between 2007 and 2011. And basically the health of their children and their families has been followed ever since. So there's lots of really useful information on these children and their families, on things like GP visits, asthma rates, etc. And the really nice thing for us is that the Born in Bradford team have got such a good relationship with the families in Bradford that it made it much easier for us to go into their homes and ask them if we could put sampling equipment in their homes for a couple of weeks. So we used a mixture of low-cost sensors, which you can see in the middle picture. That little white box there is one of the sensors in a child's bedroom. And basically they sat there for 2 weeks. They're very unobtrusive and quiet, so they don't disturb the people in the houses. We put one of those in the living room, one in the kitchen, one in the bedroom. In a subset of the houses and for 72 hours, we put the sampling equipment you can see on the right. So there's a big pump there, that grey box with the black chimney on top is basically a pump that's collecting dust from in the houses, which we can then take back to York and analyse in more detail. And the reason that we did that, obviously we couldn't leave that there for 2 weeks because it was a bit noisier, so that was a much shorter period of time. But it also gives us much more detailed information than we get from those low-cost sensors. So it's kind of compromised between the longer term measurements, which were maybe a bit less accurate, and the shorter term measurements, which were more accurate. And we tried to get a balance between the two. The other thing that we asked our families in Bradford to do was to keep a diary whilst we were sampling, so we could try and look, given that all the data we were measuring was real time with those sensors, so we got a measurement it might have been every second, but it was at least every minute. We could understand what was causing those peaks and any spikes in the data. So if we have a look at, this is just one house now, and we're looking for a week during March last year. And what this is showing is the concentration of something called PM 2.5. This is particulate matter with a very small diameter, less than 2.5 microns. And to give you a feel for what that means, because that's a strange unit that scientists use, you can see from the picture at the top, there's some comparisons with things like sand and human hair. And you can see that the PM 2.5, you could fit 4 of those across one of these PM10s, and you could fit 5 PM10s across the diameter of a human hair. So they're very small, and the reason that we care about them is because they're so small, it's really easy for them to be breathed in and get all the way down into your respiratory system where potentially it could cause damage. So it's a good indicator for the kind of harmful air pollution that we might worry about. So what this is showing here in this plot is indoor and outdoor particulate matter, this very fine particulate matter. So if we look at the red trace, first of all, you can see that there's some ups and downs in this, but it generally stays below a level of about 20 micrograms per meter cubed. And basically, if we look at the blue, which is showing you the PM 2.5 from a kitchen, you can see it looks very different. So when there are no activities in the home, it follows the outdoor quite closely. But you can see that there are lots of spikes indoors that aren't reproduced outdoors. And these spikes, these blue spikes, are nearly all associated with cooking. What's more, the concentrations can get above 500 micrograms per meter cube for these short periods where cooking happens. And to give you a feel for that, the World Health Organization recommends that we don't go above about 15 micrograms per meter cubed as a daily average value. So these are already quite substantial. So just to summarize the data from the 310 homes in Bradford. So we're looking at temperature in the top left and relative humidity on the top right, and then carbon dioxide bottom left and PM 2.5 bottom right. So these are the values from all 300 of our homes. And we've also split this up by season because we wanted to look to see if there were differences between winter, spring, summer, etc. So the first thing to notice is that there's a lot more variability between houses and between seasons. So if you look at the CO2 concentrations on the bottom left, you can see that the median value, which is denoted by this gold bar, is fairly similar across the seasons, a bit lower in the summer because we tend to have our windows open and dilute the CO2 that we breathe out indoors. But you can see when you look at the variation across houses, which is denoted by the vertical scale of these, it's much higher, and the same for the PM 2.5. We've also got lots of very high outliers in the particulate matter data, and this is caused by the cooking. And the high carbon dioxide concentrations are generally noted in the bedrooms at night time when people are breathing out and maybe have the windows closed. The variation in the environmental data, the temperature and the humidity, on the other hand, is much lower. So it's really the pollutant behaviour that varies a lot, and that's driven by behaviour. Okay, right, so just to summarise then, based on our studies in INGENIOUS and also lots of other people working in this area, we've come up with a system, a list of recommendations. So I'll go through these and hopefully they'll act as a starting point for the discussion. One of the key things is that it's really, really important to ventilate spaces properly. And this came from the COVID pandemic as well, but it's also the case just for normal activities in a house. So things like using extractor fans when you're cooking, when you're showering, opening windows when you're cleaning, ventilating bedrooms when sleeping. And also the other thing that our work has showed us is that we have to take special care for high occupancy households where we've noticed particulate matter concentrations can be even higher. And I guess there are several reasons for that. There will be more things like cooking going on, generating the particles, but also as people move around, they can disturb dust, and that can lead to higher concentrations in the air as well. Also, special consideration for households in fuel poverty, because the last thing someone who's watching, being careful to try and keep houses warm is to tell them to open windows. It doesn't always sound like sensible advice, so we need to think carefully about those households. We'd like to see national guidelines to strengthen indoor air quality established. Things like introducing a traffic light system for cleaning products, for instance, that you buy in a supermarket to give you, as a consumer, an idea about the emissions. Standardized testing procedures. Many of the things we use in our homes are tested under very carefully controlled conditions in a lab. They're not tested in household conditions where you might have varying temperature, humidity, other pollutants, for instance. Also, bespoke ventilation strategies might be needed for vulnerable populations in hospitals, care homes and schools. And also you might need additional ventilation strategies for businesses that maybe have high emitting activities like restaurants and beauty salons. Not beauty salons as it says there, I'm not quite sure what they are. And then finally, if we continue to reduce sources of outdoor air pollutants, that means it becomes much easier for all of us to just open a window when we're doing something indoors that's generating pollution. So there's more information at our website, which you can see there, but I will now stop sharing and hand back to Nicholas, I think.
Thanks very much, Nick. So yes, we've now got time to hear from a panel of experts that are joining us today. They're going to be sharing their reflections and insights on the INGENIOUS research and the recommendations that Nick just summarised. I'll be having a look at any questions you might be posting in the Zoom Q&A and also in the chat comments as well. We will be having a dedicated Q&A session after this panel discussion. So I'll hand over to Nicholas now and our panel members. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Harriet. I'm Nicholas Pleece from the University of York. With Sarah West and Jennifer Harji, I'm working on work package 7, which is the dissemination for INGENIOUS. So the structure of this is I'm going to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And then I think we've got well, I'm going to raise one discussion point with each panelist before we then move on to Q&A from the audience. If I've got that right, Harriet. That's what the instructions say anyway, so hopefully that's right. So I'll ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. I'll just use the standard Zoom practice, which is I'll list you in the order that you appear on my screen. So I'm going to start with Catherine. If you could introduce yourself first, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Kath Noakes. I'm a professor of environmental engineering for buildings at the University of Leeds. And I work on ventilation of buildings. I've looked at a range of different buildings over my career, thinking about hospitals, schools, homes, etc. And a lot of that is focused on understanding how you can use ventilation or other strategies like air cleaning to reduce exposure to pollutants. And a lot of those, the things I've looked at have been around infection, so interested in particularly in how ventilation prevents infection, but also wider air quality issues.
Many thanks, Kath. Go on to Ali next, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Ali Boddy and I am Head of Impact, Insight and Research at Global Action Plan. So we are a charity that looks at tackling root causes of climate change and the nature crisis by producing research campaigns and collective action that reconnect human and environmental health. And one of our main areas of work is around our clean air campaign. So I'll be able to talk to that a little bit today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ali. And then Chris, please. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Chris Brown, and I work for Professor Martin Williams, who can't be here today, unfortunately, because he's ill, so I'm standing in for him. We both work at the Centre for Applied Education Research, which helps run the Born in Bradford project. And I work primarily, though, for the University of Leeds, so they employ me along with Kath, and we ran the Class Act trial of air cleaning devices in schools to see if that prevented COVID transmission. So, thanks.
So many thanks. So I've got one question for you each. I think I'll retain the structure, the structure of the same order as you were introduced in. So I'll start with Kath. As an expert in indoor air quality, how do the findings from INGENIOUS affect current best practices for ventilation in UK homes, especially with the push for more energy efficient buildings?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways they influence it. So one is the fact they've got real quantitative data, and that quantitative data is coming from very controlled settings. So the experiments that Nick described around cooking and cleaning, that gives us real information to understand exactly how much gets released. So then when we're trying to estimate ventilation rates and the effect of ventilation, that sort of data can be incredibly valuable. But I think it also shows that data from real world homes and the variability and complexity of that. And it's, you know, it's quite hard to see from a graph, because you can see that there are some homes have very different air quality than others. And it's very hard to unpick exactly why. But we do know from other data that huge proportion of homes in the UK are inadequately ventilated. And by that just doesn't just mean people don't necessarily use what's there. There isn't something there for them to use in the first place properly. So lots of homes don't actually have the right ventilation installed for people to even use, or if they do, you know, it's not usable, or people don't, you know, or it's not safe to use. For example, it might rely on windows and people find it's you know, it's not safe or secure for them to open those windows. So I think really, as we go forward, It's a huge challenge because most of our housing stock already exists, and it's much easier to intervene in new housing than older housing. But we really do need to think about how we intervene in older housing to retrofit that. And you mentioned net zero in there as well. And I think that is, or energy efficiency, that is a real challenge, because people's immediate priority is comfort and their bills. And of course, in the winter, you shut the windows and you don't use things like ventilation as much. But then that has a massive negative consequence on health, and potentially your building as well. You know, if you don't ventilate and you get mold and damp, that's then the building and your health that's had a consequence. So I think there's a real challenge in there. Maybe we can explore that a little bit more as we go further through today around some of the things that we might need to be able to do in regulation, and as well as practical steps people can take.
Alrighty, thanks for that, Kath. I'll go on to Ali next. So, Ali, you've heard the findings from INGENIOUS. How can the Global Action Plan and others use these findings, do you think, to improve air quality at home?
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm not going to repeat some of the great points that I think Catherine's just made, that I think do amplify some of this. But for us, I suppose the INGENIOUS findings offer a critical confirmation and amplification of what we're learning through some of our work at Global Action Plan, and actually thinking more further on what Catherine was talking about then in terms of retrofitting, and particularly around social housing. So it provides a real kind of scientific and policy backdrop that I think really strengthens the case for rapid supported transitions, what we would argue, away from gas. So we've recently run a project, a pilot project run in partnership with Southway Housing and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, where we supported residents in 10 homes to replace gas cookers with induction electric units. And it wasn't just about emission reductions, but was really about that improving indoor air quality. And I think this is something that the INGENIOUS findings rightly named as is being really kind of often overlooked in both kind of public discourse and policy. And so I think these findings really help us strengthen the case for this work. And for me, I think they particularly kind of speak to the behavioural and awareness support that is required around this work. So, for example, when we were working with residents, we were very much working on raising the public awareness around health risks of gas and supporting them in terms of understanding that transition with training and demonstrations, in this case, in using how to use induction hobs. And I think, as the INGENIOUS findings do point out, that ventilation in the home is really important, but I think we need to be pushing for policy changes, as ventilation alone is not enough, and especially when air quality is compromised by the source. So in our case, in what we were looking at around gas cooking. So we really make the case here for eliminating the source entirely, and we saw this directly as once electric cookers were installed in the households, those households could be safely disconnected from the gas network, and we saw immediate air quality improvements. And I think for me, one great example was one of the residents who simply reported that she stopped having to use her inhaler every single time that she was cooking. And so whilst I think it's fantastic that we've got these robust evidence to support us, I think we now collectively need to be working together to seek the policy solutions for these longer term changes, especially within those more disadvantaged communities and within social housing.
Great, many thanks. Very interesting stuff. Chris, I've got a question for you. I should have said, obviously, Nick is still on the screen, so Nick is part of the panel as well. So there's also a question for her, just in case that's not clear before we move on to the Q&A things. But so going over to you, Chris. You've done lots of works on inequality, including the effects of indoor air quality on children's health. What particularly struck you about the INGENIOUS findings, and what steps do we need to take to make all homes healthier? I mean, you might want to talk specifically about children's health within that.
Yeah, well, I suppose in particular, what's particularly striking is the dissection, if you want, of how these results fall, that it's not just, you know, it affects, the more inequality is, the more inequity there is, the worse the air quality tends to be, and the way that actually falls within certain social demographics as well, quite often due to cultural things as well, but then also the issues around poor housing. And then the knock-on effects that we know from other pieces of work that we've done that has poor health, particularly for children, then goes on to result in poor education, results in poor attainment, results in worse life chances overall, more obesity, etc., etc. And just all of these things then become more of this huge sort of tableau, if you want, of factors that ultimately play into these children's lives and lead to worse social outcomes for them. So I think what's particularly important is the way that we can start sort of at this time when money for councils, local authorities, the health service is so tight, we can start to operate in a very targeted manner. We can start actually aiming bespoke, evidence-based policy changes at particular populations and in particular areas as well. And I think certainly from the work we've also done around things such as neurodiversity and things like that, we know that actually being able to offer bespoke policy changes and bespoke interventions is really useful to actually shifting the needle, because we can target the people who really need that help most.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. I mean, I think that thing of I'm a professor of housing and society, and I think that thing of a kind of compound effects is very significant in terms of understanding what the challenges are. So I'm going to move on to the last question that I'm going to ask, which is the one.
Sorry, Nicola, can I?
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just come back in on a couple of relevant points with that?
Absolutely.
So I was just going to say, in response to Ali, one thing we're analysing at the moment, we know which of our homes in the INGENIOUS study had gas and which had electric. Some of them had both. But what we did is we separated out the ones that had just gas or just electric, and we could definitely see higher PM concentrations in the ones that had just gas. So that's interesting, and that's expected, and that's something we're working up at the moment. I think the other thing is that when we started to dig in, because we did find there's a paper that's in review at the moment, we did find higher PM 2.5 concentrations in the more deprived houses in our Born in Bradford cohort. And when we tried to dig down into that a bit more, we think it comes down to high occupancy. And that's something else I think we really need to consider, that, there are these houses that are overfilled. And that dealing with that might be the best way to deal with some of these things that we see.
Many thanks for those 2 points, Nick. So I've got a couple of questions to choose from. I think I'm going to ask you the second of the two that we've got listed, which is, what do you think the top 2 or 3 unanswered questions are in air quality in homes that we need to do more work and better understand the risks that are involved? Did you get that, Nick?
Sorry, I thought you were going back to the panel. I was thinking, oh, this would be
that was for you.
Oh, that's really, really hard. So, I mean, I guess from my point of view as an indoor air chemist, it would have been good to have got more of the chemical composition data for some of the homes. So it's really hard to get the balance between having something you can leave in someone's home that doesn't disturb them and make them lose the will to live, versus get the information that would be useful. So I think maybe developing these low cost sensors to do a bit more and do that accurately would be really good. And I think also coming up with a way of producing the information we want from homeowners, like the diary information. We realised we'd asked far too much of the homeowners, and I think coming up with the ideal survey that doesn't take too much time but collects the necessary information, I think that would have been good things to do. And certainly if we did another study, those would be 2 of the things that I would like to think about.
Many thanks. I think I'm now handing over to you, Harriet, to moderate the questions coming in the Q&A. Is that right?
Yeah, unless there's any other points that the panelists felt that they could come in on. I mean, I do wonder, Nicholas, perhaps with the question that you just asked Nicola, whether there'd be things that other people hear, whether from like Catherine or Chris or Ali, where there's maybe key areas in their sectors or their areas of expertise they'd like to see more work in. Kath's got their hand up, so let's go to Kath.
Yeah, so I'd put two in there. One is actually really understanding ventilation, because we managed to get survey data which shows, you know, whether people have extract fans installed or whether they have trickle vents and whether they use them and things. But we have very limited ability to measure any of that and to really know what happens to airflows in houses. So although we have data on things like CO2, so we can infer things like ventilation rates, we don't have much in the way of actual quantitative measurements, and it would be really good to have some of that. And then I think the other big research question is the big elephant in the room question, which is the actual real correlation between what we measure and what we see in terms of health effects. And although we know from lots of studies, cohort studies and things, that, you know, exposure to higher levels of PM, exposure to nitrous oxides and things are associated with health impacts, it's very hard to really pinpoint that in homes. And of course, because the data you do have is population scale, you will always get people go, well, I don't have any problems. But then you also have other people who, and I only mentioned somebody who said, I don't have to use my inhaler anymore. So to actually really dig into the health consequences and get those, both the population scale data and the real world stories, I think we just need so much more of that to really help sort of emphasize how you do things well and how those changes can actually make real world health impacts across the population.
I'm going to say that I think Catherine actually jumped in there on it with me as well, because I will just reiterate Catherine's point there in terms of the importance of really rooting this in people's lived experiences and real world experiences, and understanding the quantitative large scale data in relation to what is going on in people's households, the other pressures that are going on in people's lives, and actually thinking about solutions that bring together communities, that bring together local organisations, that bring together policy solutions that take all of that into account. Because I think if we take the data away from that lived experience, actually I think we are really watering down the power of what we're talking about here. And so actually some of these people are having very complex lives in very complex situations, and talking about changing from gas to electricity, it actually has cost implications, or there are lots of other aspects around that. And so I think we have to think of holistic solutions in partnership with those communities, and about how we can bring together kind of whole scale changes that will improve air quality throughout.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Kath. Any other panelists have anything to add on that? Nicholas.
Well, I'm just going to chuck something quickly into the mix, which is about control and about how to implement policy change, and something to think about there, which is, so Ali's working with social landlords. Social landlords are the easiest ones to work with because there is a governance structure, because there's a single landlord. And I think some of the things to think about around there are, we can't exercise control over how owner-occupiers behave. And private landlords, to be blunt about it, are frequently naughty, and quite often there's a subset that behave in illegal ways, technically, where enforcement around things like functions like environmental health are hugely underfunded. So it's one thing to roll out better ventilation in the social rented sector and to improve ventilation and the challenges there. It's a different set of challenges when you're talking about owner occupiers and you're asking them to spend money on modifications and improvements. and a different thing again when you're trying to modify private rented sector landlord behaviour. So that's just checking a quick housing point there.
And I think just to add to that as well, we have a real challenge across the entirety of the building sector with compliance, because we have building regulations, we have standards. Now, many of our buildings will have been built to older standards, but we've always had requirements for ventilation, and yet we can still have buildings now, modern buildings, retrofitted buildings, that don't comply with the standards. We don't have the proper building controls, proper enforcement, proper mechanisms for doing that. And you only have to look at the outfall from the Grenfell inquiry to see that there is a massive challenge in the whole of the construction sector. And that's before we've even got to thinking about what individuals do in their own homes. So I think it's a very big challenge to try and tackle some of this. And it's not just about ventilation, it's actually about the whole of the quality of the buildings that we live in and work in. Sorry, that's a bit doom and gloom, isn't it? But there is a very big challenge there. But having said that, I think a lot of people are looking at this, and there has been movement over the past few years, so hopefully that will continue.
Thanks, everyone. So I think my mind is buzzing with some questions that lead on from what Kath was just saying. And I can see there's a couple of people in the Q&A and also in the Zoom chat that have some questions that we could go into now. So just a reminder to all of our attendees, if you've got questions for any of our panelists, if you could pop them into the Q&A on the Zoom. You can find that on your bottom bar. That'd be great. You can type them in there. If you do also have them and you've put them in the webinar chat, I'll keep an eye and bring them forward there. So there are some questions relating to ventilation, to continue that thread, but also in relation to air purification, or I think, as Kath said earlier, around air cleaning strategies. So maybe if I was to weave those together, it'd be great to know if the effects of air purification and ventilation have been studied together in parallel and also on their own. Maybe we could learn a little bit more about what those air cleaning strategies are. And something I wondered actually was whether the timing of ventilation is important. So when you're to ventilate and maybe for how long for. I was also wondering whether that would play into those challenges around keeping homes warm during winter, whether a quick burst of ventilation might be good or whether it does need to be for a longer period of time. So I could see Nick nodding along when I was talking about that. And also maybe Kath, this plays into your realm as well. So any thoughts on those things?
So in terms of time of day, if you are trying to vent, the problem is that you get pollution from outdoors and indoors. So this is the first thing that makes it complicated. So depending on where you live, you might have to think about the time of day. So if you're in the middle of the country, a long way from everyone else, you can just open your windows to ventilate. If we take aside the temperature issue, whereas if you live on a busy road, you might want to avoid rush hours, or you might want to think about opening a window away from the road on the other side of the house, for instance. So there's definitely a time of day thing. With regard to the specific question in the chat, we didn't study air purification in INGENIOUS, so I can answer that one very quickly. It wasn't part of the study. And you had about 3 questions. I can't remember the other ones, Harriet.
Well, I think it was around, maybe this is something Kath could speak to, but what are the types of air purification or air cleaning strategies? I was just wondering. And then also it was interesting to know about when in the day we might consider ventilating. But I also wondered whether a quick burst of ventilation is better than none, or whether actually the ventilation needs to be whilst the source of the pollution is happening, or whether it needs to be over a longer period of time, like leaving a window open for much longer, for example.
you want me to chip in on some of those? So I guess with the time one, I mean, Nick's data might tell a bit more on some of that, but I think opening windows for short periods can actually make a really big difference, because it's the thing that you do when, you know, if you open the window during and immediately after when you've been cleaning or when you've had a shower or something like that, you can get quite a big sort of exchange of air and quite good ventilation for a short period, but without substantially cooling your house down. So it can really help just to deal with that immediate source of pollutant. Now, obviously, if you've got longer term pollutants and things, it becomes more challenging. So, for example, at night when you're breathing, if you're able to have even just a small amount of ventilation in your bedroom, that can make a massive difference. It makes not just a difference to the air quality, it makes a difference to the quality of your sleep. And there's studies that have shown people sleep better and then they perform better the next day because they've had a better ventilated bedroom. In terms of air cleaning, so I think this is something that can be really effective in certain places, and particularly if you're trying to deal with managing outdoor conditions, so poor pollution, pollutions outdoors, whether that's from traffic or whether it's from wildfires or something like that, or just it's really cold and wet and you don't want the window open, but you've still got sources of pollution in your home. That's where air cleaners can really come in, and there are studies which show they can be really quite beneficial, particularly for people who have asthma. Essentially, there's 2 or 3 main types of air cleaners. There's the most common ones are things which filter particles. So they're a really fine filter and they take particles out the air, and they can usually take particles out very, very tiny, down to less than a micron in size. So really small particles. And, you know, they don't give you completely clean air because they're only as good as how much air they can pull through them and circulate in the room, but they can clean some stuff out the air. They're less good when it comes to chemicals, but some of these devices do have things like carbon filters in, and they can help with some of the chemical pollutants. You've then got another bunch of air cleaners which do things like, so you've got a bunch which are based on ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light basically inactivates microorganisms, but it doesn't really do anything to any of your other pollutants in your home. And for some of those pollutants, it can even make some of them worse. And then you have another set which do have all sorts of things in them. So they might be ionizers, they might be ozone generators. If it says ozone generator on it, do not touch it with a barge pole, because ozone is a pollutant. And some of these other ones can potentially create secondary pollutants. So even though they might be doing good on one thing, they might be causing another problem there. So the most effective ones are probably particle filters, and they're safe, they're easy, they're widely available, and they don't cost very much money to run. They you know, they're only equivalent of a light bulb or two to run.
But I would just add here that they're completely unregulated at the moment.
Yes.
And this is somewhere else where we desperately need regulation, because at the moment anyone can go online and sell an air cleaner or air purifier, and basically they don't really have to prove that it can do what it says, or that it's not making secondary pollutants and making things worse. So it's really an area where we need regulation, I think.
100%. And I think, you know, buying from a reliable, well-recognized manufacturer, and there's guides online which can help you pick good quality air cleaners. But remember, it's a sticking plaster, it's not the solution to everything. So actually doing as Ali said, actually reducing some of the sources in the first place, if we can get rid of some of those sources or reduce them, that's a really good thing to do. And where we can't, then trying to use things like air cleaners can help us manage, particularly if you're struggling with ventilation.
Thank you. Nicholas, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just wondered if it'd be interesting after what Kath said, because to talk quickly about one of the key recommendations of INGENIOUS, which is the idea of a traffic light warning system on products, which is going to the cause of things. You know, so about the practicalities of doing that with cleaning products and other things.
Yeah, I don't know what I don't know what you've proposed there, Nick, but is that sort of an idea to?
Yeah, I think just we would quite like to see something like you get on food for high salt, high sugar. You could have high VOC emissions, for instance, so that people were aware when they're buying these things, which have got lots of additional fragrances and scents that you might not need, and whether we could develop some sort of system.
Because you do get that on some products anyway, don't you? You get it on things like paint tins and things, which are
I think, yeah.
yeah, but less so on cleaning products. And I
Yeah.
think people don't think about cleaning products, do they? And
They
personal care products as well.
Exactly. And you know, you can get a name that hides a lot of stuff, like cleaning products often have parfum on the label or perfume, and
Yeah.
that could be anything. And they only have to specify what that is if it's above a certain percentage or if it's a known causes a known allergic effect. So it's very limited, the knowledge or the information provided.
I think there's also something in the delivery mechanisms as well, isn't it? Because you know, some of these devices, products come in, they're in a spray can, so they are deliberately aerosolizing something, whereas others might be, you know, more of a liquid, and therefore, yes, you still get an evaporation effect, but you're not just injecting it into the air in the same way.
Yeah, you're not getting it into a form where it will directly go into your lungs in the
Yeah.
same way. Agreed.
There was
like,
also, oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, it's like how Ali was saying, you know, if you're switching from cooking with gas to electric, it's maybe the same behavior change switch as moving towards having a roll-on deodorant instead of one that's in a spray can. But it's around people knowing about what choices to make that can then have quite a big impact on their lives in a positive way, I mean. I could see Ali maybe wanting to jump in there, and also Nicholas.
Only just sort of to, I suppose, bring that back a little bit, that I do get slightly nervous with some of these conversations that we do. We can individualise this a lot and talk about changes in individual behaviours, which we all know, and if there are good things to do, but actually without those kind of wide-scale policy changes, I think we all should be pushing for and working together collectively to push for. And I totally take on Nick and Catherine's points earlier about the construction industry, and that there's still lots of work. But for example, policy changes, like one of the policy changes we're calling for is the ending of all gas hobs by 2035. Now, actually, that's something that you can campaign for government to commit to, that we would see actually approximately 36 million people positively impacted by in this country, via the kind of taking out of gas cooking. And so I think we have to think about this on those different levels. On that micro, what can we do at an individual level? On that meso, what can we do at organisational levels? And on that macro, what should we be doing at policy levels? And never stop being ambitious at pushing for that, whatever the political climate may or may not be doing. Essentially, this is about people's health and well-being, and has a real sense of social justice to it, as I know Chris was alluding to, in terms of where we see the impacts of indoor health quality the most as well. So I think we should carry on being ambitious.
Yes, yeah, and working across those scales.
Can I just add to that? I really agree, and I think, you know, the biggest win at the moment is to really join up the net zero policies and the health policies properly, because, you know, there are policies which are coming in anyway. Let's find the ones which we've got health benefits and really push those first, but also find the ones where there's a conflict between them, and to make sure that we join up the gaps. And ventilation is a classic example there, in that the policies around and regulation around ventilation don't always tie up with the net zero policies. And so when people do retrofits, they often miss the ventilation or don't do it properly. And to making sure that those things connect properly together, and that they are, you know, designed and tested and monitored in tandem, I think is a big win for us.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to some of the questions which we've had come through into the chat. Some around different sources of indoor air pollution, and also thinking about different places too. So one of the questions was around, how is the use of wood for heating in our homes, or maybe in certain context cooking, also, impactful to our exposure to air pollution and therefore to our health? What sort of recommendations and policies are in place for the use of wood? And also relating to that, someone had commented around pollution that was coming from cooking of different meals, certainly with frying different spices, using different oils, and thinking about this effect in other places in the world. So obviously the study we're talking about here is in Bradford, but are we aware of studies in other places in the world, particularly in India as well? So 2 questions, one around sources of air pollution from wood burning, any recommendations around that, and then also, are we looking at the effects of this in other places in the world as well, like India? Chris.
So I'm pretty sure Kath can correct me here, but one of our colleagues at the University of Leeds has done a study of the air pollution from wood burning stoves. And I think it's the equivalent of running, isn't it, something like 16 diesel cars or something like that was what came out. It's not good. Anyway, there is not a good wood burning stove. And I think the best thing you can do is not run one. Is that correct, Kath? That's what we.
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers, but yeah, I mean, there is no, you know, even though some of the stoves claim to be cleaner, well, yes, they're technically slightly cleaner than others, but they will still produce pollutants. And the uncontrolled wood burning is one of the biggest sources of urban air pollution these days. And whereas in some perhaps rural areas, there is still a need in the sense of people don't have alternatives. In most urban areas, it's now a choice for people to burn wood, and we don't need wood burners. It's there is the challenge with wood burners is, of course, you release that pollution from your house, it goes straight into your neighbour's house, so it affects everybody.
Yeah, I think I would just maybe qualify that slightly. The comparison to 16 diesel vehicles is a bit misleading because diesels are actually really clean now. There's hardly any PM emissions from diesels, so I think they could have come up with a better thing to compare them with. I also think there's a massive difference between someone using a highly inefficient wood stove and burning old bits of wood that might have paint or varnish on them versus someone using a very efficient, modern, DEFRA approved wood stove with well seasoned wood. So I'm not saying there's no particle loading from the latter, but it's definitely better than the former. So I think wood stoves are coming for a bit of a bashing, maybe because it's easy to bash the middle classes that own them. And I would actually like to see a lot more quantitative data on what they're doing. But I think, like Kath said, the main issue there is for outdoor air quality, not so much indoors, or certainly not your own indoor air quality. But I do think a lot of the publicity around wood stoves has been a bit hysterical and not terribly scientific.
Thank you. And has anyone here on the panel got any information about similar studies to INGENIOUS happening in other places, whether that's in the UK or perhaps in other countries?
Yeah, I think there are growing numbers of studies that are measuring air quality in homes, and I couldn't off the top of my head tell you what they've done in other countries. I think one of the really interesting challenges is how you take the data from studies like INGENIOUS and put it together with all the other studies that have done some of that, to create big data sets. And I hope that's something that will happen better over the next few years as all the people who've been doing these studies are talking together and thinking about how you do things like that.
I also think that we probably need a few more pollutants. So I think there's quite a lot of PM data now from different places. And we probably know quite a lot about PM concentrations in different countries indoors, but I don't think we know so much about the volatiles and all these aroma chemicals. And that's where it would be really interesting to extend the data set. But in terms of herbs and spices from cooking Indian food, we have a few studies now that have looked in quite a lot of detail at what sort of emissions you get from cooking different spices. So I'd say there's information in the literature on that. So the person who put that question, if they get in touch with me afterwards, I can pass on some papers. But But yes, and we've obviously studied the curries as well, based on some of the food that we knew our born in Bradford people like to eat, because that's where we got our meal ideas from.
Didn't you do one in the US as well, Nick? Didn't you do?
They did, but they
Was that a roast dinner in the US?
They did a Thanksgiving dinner. They did a full English, a stir fry, and I think they might have done a chili as well, but they didn't do curry as far as I can remember. And a full English was one of the worst things. And I never quite understood why an American study was looking at a full English. That was slightly bizarre, but.
Thank you. Switching slightly now, I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about the relationship between indoor air quality and outdoor air quality. In Nick's presentation, there was the graph which showed the level of, was it particulate matter, Nick, in the outdoors, and then comparing that with the spikes of particulate matter in indoors. And I wondered if we could just comment on the role of indoor air pollution sources affecting our outdoor air quality, from polluting from in to out. And also I wondered whether this might relate to Chris's point earlier around disadvantaged communities as well, and maybe how that plays into places that not only have high occupancy, but also high housing density as well, and how that impacts our outdoor air quality in those places as well.
So I can say a bit about what we did in Ingenious. So as part of the Ingenious study, we had a mobile van which had the ability to measure some of those volatile compounds I was talking about, as well as nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. And it basically drove in kind of figure-of-8 loops around Bradford. And we did that at different times of the day. I think there were about 30 circuits done in all. So what you can do when you have that much data is start to look at the background, and you can start to look at enhancements above the background for different pollutants. And what they've done with that, and this is just being prepared for publication at the moment, is they looked at, there's a very high density of restaurants in Bradford. So we had a pretty good idea of where we'd expect to find cooking emissions from indoors, outdoors. But they've also looked at things like beauty salons and garages where people are fixing cars, so using oils and solvents and that sort of stuff. So it looks like when you do that, you can start to see traces for indoor emissions outdoors, and we can see different pollutants that peak near the restaurants compared to the ones that peak near the garages. So I think this is kind of an emerging area of research, and there's now studies from the US and from China that are indicating that maybe 25 to 30% of some of the pollutants they measure outdoors are coming from indoors. So I think that's definitely an area for future research, given that things like vehicle electrification and removal of domestic combustion, like getting rid of gas, is going to start making outdoor air quality better.
Kath, do you want to chip in?
I was just going to say, it's interesting, Nick, that you mentioned certain places there, like restaurants and garages and beauty salons. And I think, you know, when you start looking at guidance and regulation around ventilation and air quality, it really differs by some of the different sectors. So restaurants, there are requirements in terms of ventilation in the kitchens in restaurants, but then the requirements in the bit of the restaurant where everybody sits is really quite limited. You know, it's just sort of general guidance. And of course, occupational environmental health officers will inspect kitchens and will consider whether they've got ventilation and things like that. But then places like beauty salons, garages, the ventilation requirements are really quite limited. And I don't even know whether there are specific regulations for those settings, but I don't believe there are, particularly because they're not seen as, unless they've got explicit hazards for something that they're working with that requires something like a local exhaust ventilation, then they're not in there. And I just think how many times you've been in a hairdresser or a beauty salon and thought there is no ventilation, or there's no managed ventilation. They might have the doors and windows open, but there's no sort of consideration of it at all.
Right. And I also wonder about, when you go into a department store and you have the misfortune to walk through the perfume section.
Yes.
What is that to you?
Yeah.
And also places like Lush with all the
Yes.
fragrances in their products as well. I do wonder what the regulations are indoors for the people working in those locations.
Thank you. Just to address some of the questions that have come in, there was a question related to our chat earlier about the traffic light system and labeling of products so that people could make better informed choices. So there was someone commenting around, could we create something like a seal of approval, which we could provide to brands that are creating safer products? So I think that was, I can see people nodding, but I think that probably comes in with recommendations and the approval of more certified or more trusted providers of products that are going to meet the requirements that we need. So I don't know if anyone needs to comment on that, but I think it came up in an early discussion. I'm mindful of time, and there was another question in that pulled on our previous discussion point around needing more research on the link between indoor air pollution exposure and then people's health. So I guess their physical health, their mental health, lots of components of human health there, I guess. So what things are needed there to improve the knowledge of those linkages? So I guess this could be to all panel members, but what's not been done yet? What's happening in that space? What kind of research do we need to link the exposure people are having through to the impacts on their health? I guess in an experimentally tested way, but also I guess anecdotally as well.
So I think one of the challenges there is it's really hard to do that sort of study. So we've got data now which relate outdoor air quality and health. And for those studies, you can do it at a population scale. So you can take, for example, data, across the city of Bradford, for example, on asthma, exacerbations or emergency calls or ambulance calls and things like that. And you can look at how that correlates to outdoor air pollution in the city, and whether you get, peaks of, peak hospitalization peaks at the same time as you get peaks in outdoor air data. And that allows you to show relationships and to, and we've got data from sort of around the world now. But with indoors, it's so much more challenging because everybody's indoor environment is different. So you might get, the same group of people living in Bradford who are all exposed to the same outdoor air, but one might have a really good indoor air environment and the house next door might have a really poor indoor environment. And so without actually being able to measure those specific environments, you don't know. So in order to get that data, you actually need to get data on the air quality that's specific to that person, not just the general air quality. And you need to then get the activities of that person. So when they're exposed to that particular air pollution, and then you need their health data. And I think we're getting much closer to that. So we're starting to now be able to relate, we've got cohort studies like Born in Bradford, like Biobank and things, where we've got data on human health. And then we're starting to be able to then send some of those people with answers to get that data. Things like INGENIOUS will build that data set which allow you to do that. But of course, we need a lot more of it, because to get that correlation at population scale, you need a lot of data to do it. So it's hard, but we're going that way.
Nick, do you want to add in?
Yeah, so I guess from the point of view of the INGENIOUS study, one thing that I showed in my presentation was that we had those spikes in PM that were caused by the cooking from indoors, and then we had that kind of much lower background contribution from outdoor particulate matter. So we know that people indoors, we just focus on particulate matter exposed to a kind of underlying low concentration that's coming through the windows, but superimposed on that are these very high, short-lived spikes from cooking. What we don't know at the moment is whether those spikes, which are probably well over 10 times higher than the World Health Organization recommendations, are they harmful to health or not? Because all the health data, like Kath said, has been focused on looking at outdoor exposures. So things like diesel particulate. We have no idea at the moment if the toxicity of cooking particulate is better or worse for us than diesel particulate. And I guess your gut feeling tells you that the diesel particulate is probably worse, but we don't actually know that at the moment. So at Manchester, one of our sister projects is called HipTalks, and they are doing just that. So what they did was they took admittedly small groups of professors from the department, because it's easier to get ethical approval to subject your professors to things than to members of the public. And they took these groups of professors and sat them in a chamber, and they exposed them to diesel particles, cooking particles, particles that you might expect to get when you use cleaning products, and wood stove particles. So that data set is now being worked up, and it will be published very soon. But I think that's the sort of study that we need. We need to understand, you know, are these very high concentrations of cooking particulate bad for us? Or they might be high, but they might actually not be doing us any harm. And at the moment, we just don't know. And I think it's those differential toxicity impacts that we really need to understand.
Thanks, Nick. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I've got a final question from myself. This webinar is part of London Climate Action Week, and I wondered if we could hear from the panel a few more reflections on the interplay of indoor air pollution and net zero. So as we're moving towards different energy efficiency measures, and we've talked about retrofitting and changes to homes, but also thinking about new builds and different standards that they might be meeting in terms of energy efficiency, being labelled more as airtight. What's this interplay between taking action on climate change and then also ensuring that our indoor air is good for us to breathe?
I can start if you like. I mean, I think there's, you know, there are a whole load of interactions, which we've touched on some already. So decarbonisation, so taking out gas cooking, is, you know, that's a really obvious one, and that's a really relatively simple one in the scheme of things. You're replacing one cooking method with another cooking method. There might be a cost difference in terms of electricity versus gas, but beyond that, it doesn't really do much. It's quite a minimal disruption to your home. Insulation of homes, I think, is another important part, because it will make homes more airtight. If it's done well, then you've got warmer homes, so you've got better thermal comfort. Maybe you can actually ventilate better if you've actually got a warmer home in the first place. But if it's done badly, some of them end up with moisture problems and therefore damp and mold, which creates a new problem in there. I think thinking about how we heat our homes is another important part. So we've touched on wood burning already, but actually, again, decarbonising, moving from, you know, gas and oil onto heat pumps. But those are a much more expensive and disruptive option for people. So it you know, they can be really good. I got a heat pump last year and went away from my really stinky oil boiler, which was fantastic. But I know it's not a cheap option for people. And so those need to be planned in terms of how we retrofit. And of course, one of the challenges there is you use a heat pump differently. So you use a heat pump to heat your home to a sort of continuous comfortable level, rather than the intermittent heating that we're perhaps more used to with gas and oil. So you have to then factor that in. It's much harder to turn it off to save money in the same way as you perhaps would do with a conventional gas heating system. So thinking about both the technology and the costs and things, but also thinking how that impacts on people's behaviours is really important.
Yeah, and I think the cost is really important there. Because there are lots of people that would like a heat pump but couldn't afford it. It's the same with replacing a gas hob with an induction hob. It's a fairly simple thing to do, like Kath said. Scientifically, it makes sense. Climatically, it makes sense. Health-wise, it makes sense. But it's just, where's the money going to come from? And also, you've got issues like, if you can imagine a row full of terraces, they probably can't have heat pumps. You need to have an individual solution. And I think what Ingenious has really taught us about is the need to understand behaviour. So there's no point just saying that one solution will fit all. You need to understand a home and how people use that home to really be able to improve things.
I completely echo what Catherine and Nicola have said here. And I think there is a job now for all of us to be able to take this data and think about the so what of it. So actually, what can this look like in terms of policy solutions? And we need to work across the academic sector. We need to work across the third sector. We need to work across industry. We need to work across the politics to try and think about what these different solutions can look like in different scenarios. So we are addressing this in social housing and private rented, and across the board to be able to take forward some of these solutions. But I think that really requires us within this arena to all be working together for that same goal.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, I think that pulls together the question and answer session. So thank you for those thought-provoking comments and conversations between you all. I wonder, Nicholas, do you have any final reflections or remarks before I bring the webinar to an end?
There is one more question, Harriet, that's just appeared.
Oh, sure. Let's deal with this one. So the question is, what are some relatively simple ways people could reduce their exposure to indoor air pollution, such as not using scented candles and not using spray deodorants? Go, fire away.
Okay, so I think switching from sprays to cream cleaners and roll-on deodorants, like we said earlier. The other thing you can do is always use your cooker hood, always use your shower extractor fan where possible. If you haven't got one, ventilate for the period where you're showering or cooking and for maybe half an hour afterwards. That way, if you're cooking, you only lose the excess heat you generated during cooking, not extra heat. You can use the back rings on a hob because they're more effective with the cooker hood than the front rings. You can boil and steam your food instead of frying it. Frying generates more particles than any other type of cooking. You can move from a meat diet to a vegetarian diet because vegetarian diets are generally better from you, despite the data I showed you earlier. On average, frying meat is one of the best ways of generating particles, so you can avoid doing that. I think that's it. I'm sure Kath has got a few more.
I was just wondering, Nick, did you look at air fryers at all?
We've just started to, yeah, we have done that a bit. It's interesting. So we're just looking at the data.
Yeah, because I imagine they must be better than open frying.
Yes, absolutely, but not pollutant free either.
Pollutant free. Yeah, the only other one I would add is keep your home clean, so vacuum your home regularly, and just think about cleaning products. We don't need to spray and obsessively clean everything. You know, think about how you selectively use cleaning products so you're exposed to less chemicals.
Thank you. Some great tips there. And I know it's been mentioned a couple of times, but I'm sure you can head to the INGENIOUS website and you'll find more information about those sorts of things. Nicholas, any more from you?
Yes, I've been asked to sum up. I should qualify it in two ways. I'm a social scientist, which means I'm not a real one. And I've been working on work package 6 and on work package 7. And this should have also been my colleague, Professor Sarah West, rather than me, summing up. So with those caveats, I mean, obviously this is hugely important stuff. And that's the thing that comes across most strongly in terms of what INGENIOUS has achieved, what INGENIOUS has found, that there is something real here, there is something tangible here, there is a public health concern, there's a wider number of concerns across everything from regulation of cleaning products through to building standards and what we do around retrofit. This is happening in a complex environment in terms of how we instigate change and how we translate the findings of Ingenious into practice. We're a much, I mean, as Chris and Ali have talked about and alluded to, we're a much more unequal society than we were 40 or 50 years ago. There are clear patterns around associations with other aspects of inequality and indoor air quality. So that when people are experiencing indoor air quality problems, they're also, as Nick was saying, maybe in situations of overcrowding, which has got worse in the last 30 years. It's not where it used to be, but housing conditions have deteriorated. We're also in an environment that's much more market-led, much more commodified than it used to be. Government's much less active in a regulatory sense than it used to be. So things like there is no standard for whether or not your air cleaner actually is an air cleaner. There's no definition as to what an extractor fan is. Some of them don't actually extract to the outside. Some of them have just got sort of filters on the top, and whether or not that does anything, that's not a question I can answer. But there isn't a kind of universal standard around that. So there are lots of challenges here because you can't just kind of issue rules in the way that you used to, but there's clear evidence here that we should think about regulation, we should think about legal changes, we should think about other ways of changing behaviour. I mean, I'd pick up on what Ali said around individual behaviour. I mean, what we're starting to see in some other fields like public health in relation to diet is that behavioural interventions can have quite limited effects, and it depends whose behaviour you're talking about. So maybe thinking more about landlord behaviour, developer behaviour, manufacturer behaviour, as well as providing advice and support for individuals and households as to what they should do. So the questions are complicated, the answers are complicated. But the other thing I suppose I'd highlight from what Ingenious has achieved and what all the work groups have achieved, and obviously what Nick's achievement in getting this together and getting it funded and getting it delivered, is it does already generate some quite clear messaging as to what we need to do. So it's about, don't mix the cleaning products together. Be careful that you're well ventilated when you're doing things. Be careful when you're doing some kinds of cooking compared to other kinds of cooking, because there are these potential risks. Think about how you might modify aspects of, if you could afford to change the gas hob to the induction hob, if you can get a better extractor fan in the kitchen, all of these things are actionable. So something that Ingenious has achieved is there's enough evidence here and within the context of other evidence building up to signify that we need to think about behavioural change, and if we go back to every other public health hazards, we go back to, it takes a long time to get the argument against tobacco fully applied. We're starting to see a shift against alcohol that's got parallels with what happened around the reduction of smoking in society. And I think this field of research is going to be another one of those areas where we start to see more and more evidence around indoor air quality, and we start to get a bigger response. What can I say about Ingenious overall? I mean, it's been a privilege to work on the project. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. I think it might also be one of the pebbles that precedes the avalanche as well.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm sure you'll all agree that this webinar has been really interesting and informative. I'm personally feeling inspired and invigorated to take action where I can. I'm going to continue sleeping with my bedroom window open. Remember that this webinar has been recorded and it will soon be uploaded to the University of York's Environmental Sustainability Institute's YouTube channel. I know that a colleague of mine has been posting lots of useful links in the Zoom chat, so feel free to open some of those and grab them before we go. And do share the recording with any colleagues, family members, or friends if you think they'd find it useful and interesting. And again, to remind you, if you'd like to find out more about the INGENIOUS project, you can head to the website, which is ingenious.york.ac.uk. And thanks again for joining us in this webinar.